Hello, and welcome back to another evening together. Tonight we're settling in with something a bit special, and honestly something I've been wanting to do for a while now. We're going to walk through the entire Dexter universe, all 8 original seasons plus New Blood, but not the way most recaps do it. We're not going to go episode by episode. We're not going to list every kill or rank every villain. What we're going to do instead is trace the chain reactions, the cause and effect. Every major catastrophe in this show, every broken relationship and ruined life and tragic ending, you can trace it back to a decision made seasons earlier, sometimes years earlier, sometimes decades. And I find that genuinely fascinating in a way that makes the show feel more coherent than people give it credit for, even the weaker later seasons. Because when you step back and look at the whole run of it, Dexter is essentially one very long story about what happens when one bad decision doesn't just have consequences, but has consequences that have consequences that have consequences. It keeps going. The ripple never fully stops. The show itself actually acknowledged this directly. In season 3, there's a moment where Dexter is reflecting on his decision to teach Miguel Prado the code, and he thinks about the butterfly effect. The idea that a butterfly beating its wings in Brazil can set off a storm in Florida. He frames it as something beautiful, something almost philosophical. At that point in the story, he still thinks he can control the outcome of his choices. He thinks he's the one holding the net, and that's what's so quietly devastating about watching it back, knowing what's coming. He never is. So that's what tonight is. We're going to untangle every major thread in the show, starting not with the pilot episode, but with something that happened in 1973, long before the show begins. Because that's where the first butterfly is. A shipping container in Miami, a little boy who shouldn't have survived, and a policeman who made a decision that changed everything. Before we get into it, if you like this kind of thing, long-form story breakdowns, lore dives, narrative analysis at an hour that makes sense to nobody, then do consider subscribing. It helps more than you'd think, and there's a lot more of this kind of content on the way, right? Get comfortable. We've got a lot of ground to cover and nowhere to be. Now, one thing worth saying before we get into the actual content is that this covers pretty much everything. All 8 original seasons, New Blood, and a few touches on where the franchise has gone since. So if you're somewhere in the middle of a first watch, just be aware. We're going wide open on spoilers from the very start. That said, if you've already seen it, or if you're just here for something calm to listen to, you're exactly where you need to be. Also, a small note on New Blood. It aired in late 2021 as a limited revival series, and it's set about 10 years after the original finale up in Iron Lake, New York. It's a more contained story than the original run, but it matters enormously for the butterfly effect conversation because it's where so many of the chains from the original show finally land. So we'll get there. And one more thing before we really begin, there's a version of this show where you could argue Dexter is a monster who got exactly what he deserved. And there's another version where you could argue he was a product of circumstances that no one child should ever have to survive. The interesting thing about watching the whole run is that both of those things are true at the same time, and the show never lets you fully settle on either. That tension is part of what makes it worth spending this much time with. There's something else worth mentioning, which is that for most of the show's run, Dexter's biggest enemy isn't actually any of the serial killers or the police investigators closing in on him. His biggest enemy is himself. Specifically, it's a particular habit he has of making decisions that serve his immediate emotional needs while completely ignoring the downstream consequences for the people around him. He delays killing someone because he wants to study them first. He befriends someone he should stay away from because he's lonely. He spares someone he should have killed because he's distracted and ready to move on with his life. And every single time, that choice ends up destroying something or someone. I think that's why the show holds up as well as it does on reflection, even though the writing quality dips noticeably after season 4. The structure underneath it, the cause and effect architecture, is genuinely elegant. Season 8's ending gets a lot of grief, some of it deserved, but even the worst seasons are full of threads that connect back to decisions made years earlier. When you trace those threads, the whole thing feels more intentional than it probably was in the writer's room. It's also worth saying that Dexter ran for 8 original seasons, which is a long time for any show to maintain a consistent internal logic. The fact that you can sit down now and trace a coherent line from the first episode to the last is actually an achievement. Most long-running dramas drift. Characters change without clear motivation, story arcs get abandoned, consequences get ignored. Dexter isn't immune to any of those things in its weaker seasons, but the core causal chain stays intact all the way through. That's worth something. Right, let's talk about how all of this began. One thing worth mentioning before we do, because I keep forgetting to say it and then getting comments about it. The structure tonight isn't chronological in the traditional sense. We're not going season by season in a way where I just summarize the plot. We're going thematically and causally. We're asking, where did this start? What did it create? And where did that lead? So some sections will cover a whole season, some will focus on a single decision, and some will zoom out and look at connections across multiple seasons at once. It'll make sense as we go, I promise. There's also a section near the end where we go through some of the big what-if scenarios. What if certain key choices had gone differently? What if the second season had ended differently? What if the most famous decision in the whole show, the one at the center of season 4, had never happened? Those are genuinely interesting to sit with because the answers reveal something about what the show is actually about underneath all the blood and plastic wrap. A quick note on geography and timeline while we're setting things up. The show is set in Miami, though a lot of the exterior shots were actually filmed in Long Beach, California. Dexter Morgan works as a blood spatter analyst for the Miami Metro Police Department, which is a fictional department but feels grounded enough that it rarely pulls you out of the show. The original series ran from 2006 to 2013, 96 episodes across 8 seasons, all on Showtime. And then New Blood arrived in 2021, a limited run of 10 episodes set in a completely different environment up in the New York woods, which gave the franchise a very different texture from the Miami heat and color of the original. If you've only ever seen the first few seasons, or if it's been a while and the details are a bit fuzzy, don't worry. We'll be moving through things at a relaxed pace, and I'll fill in whatever context is needed as we go. There's no quiz at the end. The point is the chain, not the chronology. All right, 1973, Miami. Let's start there. In 1973, a woman named Laura Moser made a series of choices that got her killed in front of her 2 young sons. She had been working as a police informant, feeding information to Harry Morgan, a Miami detective, about a drug trafficking operation run by a man named Santos Jimenez. At some point, Jimenez found out, and he responded the way people like Jimenez tend to respond. Laura was murdered with a chainsaw. Her 2 boys, Brian and Dexter, were locked inside a shipping container with her body. They were left there for 2 days. Dexter was 3 years old. Now, the show doesn't linger on this in graphic detail. We get fragments of it across the seasons, mostly through Dexter's fractured memories and through the backstory that gets filled in over time. But the event itself is the foundation of everything. It's the original rupture. Everything in the next 50-odd years of this story, in one way or another, flows back to those 2 days in a metal box. Harry Morgan was the detective assigned to the scene. He found the boys, and he made a decision in that moment that would define the next several decades. He took Dexter home. He adopted him. He raised him as his own alongside his biological daughter, Deborah. That decision, taking in a traumatized 3-year-old who had just witnessed something no child should ever have witnessed, is itself a beautiful impulse. Harry Morgan was, by most accounts, a decent man. Genuinely caring, he wanted to do right by this boy. And for a while, it looked like he had. Dexter grew up, he went to school, he had a sister, a home, a police officer for a father. From the outside, it looked fine, but Harry noticed things, small things at first, a coldness, a detachment, a fascination with death that went a bit beyond what you could write off as a phase. He found Dexter with dead animals. Then he found out about Nick, a boy at school who Dexter had considered killing because of something petty and small. And Harry made the second fateful decision in this chain. He didn't get Dexter into therapy. He didn't bring in psychiatrists. He didn't report what he was seeing. He decided to manage it himself. He decided that if the urge to kill couldn't be extinguished, then it could be directed, shaped, given a code. And so the code was born. Only kill killers. Only target people who have escaped the justice system through corruption, technicalities, or a lack of evidence. Make sure, always make sure, don't kill innocents, never get caught, leave no trace. Use the knowledge of police procedure, which Harry would teach him, to avoid detection. And the thing is, the code is so central to the show that it can start to feel almost reasonable after a while. And in a certain light, it is. Dexter's targets in the early seasons are genuinely terrible people. Child murderers, repeat offenders, men who killed again and again because the system had no mechanism to stop them. In that sense, the code has an internal logic. But the code was also a decision made by one man in private, without any external accountability or oversight, to essentially program a future serial killer. Harry decided that he knew better than any professional. He decided that the solution to a traumatized child developing dangerous urges was to give those urges a rule set, rather than try to address their root cause. And the thing is, by the time Harry truly understood the full extent of what he had created, it was too late. There's a moment, alluded to in Season 8 through recorded interviews that surfaced later, where Harry witnessed Dexter doing something in the field that clarified everything. What he had made, what the training had produced. And by the accounts that filter through the series, that moment contributed to Harry's decline. His heart condition worsened. He died relatively young. Whether the official cause of death was purely physical, or whether guilt played a role, is something the show leaves deliberately ambiguous, but the implication is clear enough. The other boy in the container, Brian, was not adopted by Harry. Brian was sent into the psychiatric care system, where he spent his childhood and adolescence. He remembered everything about what happened to their mother. He grew up without the code, without Harry's structure, without Dexter's carefully maintained double life. He grew up into someone far more openly dangerous, far less controlled, and with one driving obsession: finding his brother. We'll get to what Brian became in a later section, because his story unfolds in Season 1, and it's one of the most affecting parts of the whole show. But it's important to note here, right at the start, that the separation of these two boys is itself a butterfly. Harry chose one and not the other. That choice created two very different people from the same starting point. And those two people would eventually find each other, with devastating consequences. So before a single episode of the show has aired, the chain is already in motion. A woman gets killed by a drug trafficker. A detective takes one of her sons home. He decides to secretly train that son to be a controlled killer rather than seek proper help. The other son disappears into the system. And somewhere deep in Dexter's developing mind, in the years between that container and the first episode, the Dark Passenger takes root. Harry called it the Dark Passenger because it was easier to think of it as something separate from Dexter, something that lived alongside him rather than inside him. A passenger, not a driver. But one of the quieter revelations of the show is that the Dark Passenger isn't a separate entity at all. It's just Dexter. It's the part of him that Harry most feared and the part that Harry most carefully shaped. And in the end, those two things might not be as different as Harry hoped. The butterfly beat its wings in 1973 in a shipping container in Miami. And the storm it set off would take another 40 years to fully arrive. The code sounds tidier and summary than it ever was in practice. And I think that's intentional on the show's part, even if it wasn't always conscious. Because the thing about the code is that it was designed around an assumption that never quite held up. That the Dark Passenger could be satisfied by a steady supply of bad people, and that satisfaction would be enough to keep Dexter stable. Harry's model was essentially maintenance. Keep the engine running in a controlled direction and it won't overheat. Give the killing a channel and it won't flood. What Harry didn't fully account for was that Dexter was also a person. Not a fully emotionally connected one, at least not initially, but a person with curiosity, with loneliness, with a need for something that felt like meaning. And the code, for all its careful construction, didn't really address any of that. It told Dexter what to do. It didn't tell him who to be. The early kills we hear about in the show's mythology are mostly animals. Dexter starts, as these things apparently often do according to criminological literature, with neighborhood pets and wildlife. Harry catches him at it, reacts with a kind of resigned parental recognition rather than horror. And that response, that Harry's primary reaction to his adopted son killing animals is to accelerate the training rather than seek external help, tells you a lot about how Harry was thinking about all of this. He had already accepted what Dexter was. He just wanted to point it somewhere useful. The first human kill that we're given details about is a man named Matt Chambers, a repeat offender who Harry believed had killed multiple women but who had avoided conviction. Harry brought Dexter to Chambers. He laid out the evidence. He walked Dexter through the process, and Dexter killed him. He was 17. There's something deeply uncomfortable about that detail when you sit with it. Harry facilitated a murder carried out by a teenager. His justification was that Chambers would have killed again, and Harry might have been right about that. But it doesn't make the act less troubling as an adult decision. Harry involved a child in lethal vigilante justice because he believed he had correctly assessed the situation, and he trusted his own judgment entirely. The kills after that become more regular. Dexter gets better at them. He develops the ritual, the kill room, the plastic wrap, the careful staging, and cleanup. He takes trophies, blood slides, a small drop of blood from each victim preserved between two pieces of glass. He builds a box of them. This habit, the blood slide collection, becomes one of the most important recurring details in the whole series, because those slides are evidence. Physical, irrefutable evidence of every kill. And Dexter keeps them, which is, when you think about it, a meaningful choice. A person who had truly internalized the code's directive to never get caught would not keep trophies. The slide suggests that somewhere under the controlled exterior, Dexter wants to be known. Harry dies somewhere in Dexter's young adult years before the show begins. The official cause is heart failure. The implied cause, or at least the contributing factor, is that Harry saw something in Dexter during one of the later stages of the training that broke something in him. The recorded interviews that appear in Season 8, conducted by a neuropsychiatrist named Dr. Evelyn Vogel, show Harry expressing profound guilt. He talks about whether he did the right thing. He sounds like a man who knows he didn't, but made his peace with it too late to change anything. Vogel, it turns out, had advised Harry on how to construct the code. She's introduced in Season 8 as a new character, but her involvement goes back decades. She's a neuropsychiatrist who specializes in psychopathy and who believed, somewhat controversially in her field, that psychopaths could function in society if properly channeled. Harry consulted her when he was trying to figure out what to do with Dexter. She helped him develop the framework. So the code wasn't just Harry's invention, it was a collaborative project between a grieving detective and a scientist who saw Dexter partly as a case study, which adds another layer to what Dexter has been living inside his entire life. The moral framework he treats as inherited wisdom from his father is actually partly the product of a professional who was also, on some level, conducting an experiment. Dexter doesn't know this at the start of Season 8. When he finds out, it destabilizes things in ways we'll come back to. But the more immediate consequence of Harry's death is this. The code becomes frozen. It was designed by a man who is no longer alive to revise it, to update it, to respond to circumstances Harry didn't anticipate. It exists as a static set of rules applied to an increasingly dynamic and unpredictable life. And static rules applied to dynamic situations have a way of eventually breaking down. Harry continues to exist in the show as a hallucination. Dexter holds internal conversations with him, imagines his father's reactions to situations, uses the imagined Harry as a kind of moral sounding board. This is both touching and a little disturbing because it means Dexter never truly develops his own moral reasoning. He outsources it to a dead man's imagined version. Every difficult decision Dexter makes for the first several seasons is filtered through what he thinks Harry would say. There's a line of thinking, which the show seems to endorse in its quieter moments, that this is part of why Dexter keeps making the same kinds of mistakes. He isn't learning. He's consulting a fixed internal authority who can't update his advice based on new information. The ghost of Harry can only ever give Dexter the answers Harry already knew. And Harry didn't know everything, not by a long stretch. Season 1 of Dexter introduces us to Dexter Morgan as a fully functioning adult. He has the job at Miami Metro, He has a girlfriend, Rita, a kind and quietly resilient woman who is recovering from an abusive marriage. He has Deborah, his sister, also a police officer working in vice and desperate to transfer to homicide. And he has his carefully maintained double life. Then someone starts leaving him presents. The ice truck killer, as the press names him, is killing women, draining them of blood, and leaving the bodies arranged in theatrical, bloodless tableau. Dismembered body parts, beautifully preserved and displayed, with no blood at the scenes. The kills are technically extraordinary, clean in a way that demonstrates serious knowledge and skill. And the patterns keep referencing things from Dexter's specific childhood and psychology, things no stranger should know. The ice truck killer is Brian Moser, Dexter's biological older brother. Brian grew up in the psychiatric system after being separated from Dexter following their mother's murder. He remembered everything, including the container, including what happened to their mother, including Santos Jimenez, and the whole story that Harry had quietly suppressed from Dexter's upbringing. Brian spent decades tracking his brother down. The elaborate killing pattern, the bloodless presentation, the mirroring of their mother's crime scene. It was all designed as a message, a calling card, a way of saying, I know what you are because I am what you are, and I've come to find you. Dexter is drawn to Brian in a way he isn't drawn to anyone else in his life up to that point, and it's worth being honest about why. Brian offers him something that Harry's code never did: recognition. Brian sees Dexter completely and clearly, the dark passenger and all of it, and doesn't flinch. He doesn't try to manage it or redirect it or contain it. He just sees it as a fact and extends his hand. Brian has been dating Deborah under the alias Rudy Cooper, specifically to get close to Dexter. He's been patient about this, methodical. He found Deborah through police department records and spent months building the relationship. He genuinely seems to like her, or at least to not particularly want to harm her, but she is primarily a means to an end. The confrontation, when it comes, is one of the most emotionally loaded moments in the series. Brian kidnaps Deborah and presents Dexter with a choice. Come with me, leave this constructed life. Kill Deborah, cut the last tie to Harry's world, and be free. Or stay and lose the only person who has ever truly known you. What makes this choice so agonizing in retrospect is that Brian isn't entirely wrong in his reading of Dexter's situation. Harry's code is a cage, even if it's a comfortable one. The normal life that Dexter has built is a performance. The friends and colleagues and the girlfriend are all part of a carefully maintained fiction. Brian is offering Dexter the chance to stop pretending. But Dexter chooses the pretending. He saves Deborah. He kills Brian. And the downstream consequences of that choice are worth thinking about. The most obvious one is this: Dexter has just killed the only person in his life who understood him completely. He will spend the next 7 seasons of the show searching in various ways for some version of that connection again, with Lila, with Miguel, with Lumen, with Hannah. None of them fully replicate what Brian offered, partly because Dexter is always, on some level, keeping something back. There's also a quieter consequence that matters a lot for Deborah. She was in love with Brian, or with Rudy as she knew him. The discovery that the man she loved was a serial killer and that her brother killed him is something she carries forward. Her therapist brings this up in season 6, and the show tries to suggest that her relationship with Dexter might be tangled up in something more complicated than sisterly affection. That particular thread is handled clumsily by the writers, but the underlying observation is real. Deborah keeps being drawn into proximity with dangerous people, and Dexter is always at the center. Brian's death also has a consequence that plays out in season 2. Dexter feels genuine grief over killing his brother. Not the performed grief he's used to, not the emotional mimicry he's spent years perfecting, but something that actually hurts. He goes through a period of destabilization in the aftermath. And that destabilization, the way it affects his judgment in the months that follow, directly contributes to the situation that season 2 is built around. One other note here. Brian's alias was Rudy Cooper. He was working as a prosthetic specialist, which gave him access to the kind of clinical knowledge and precision tools that enabled his kills. The show takes some care with this, giving him a plausible professional cover that explains the skill of the crimes. And in a weird way, Brian and Dexter mirror each other professionally. One works in blood analysis for the police. One works in prosthetics that interfaces with the body. Both of them use technical expertise as a cover for something much darker underneath. The last image we get of Brian in season 1 is Dexter weeping over his body. It's one of the few moments in the early series where the show clearly believes Dexter is genuinely sad, not performing sadness. And that rawness is part of why the scene works as well as it does. He killed the only person who ever fully knew him. And then he put him in the ocean like all the others. That's a loneliness that doesn't go away. There's a detail about Brian that I think about sometimes, which is that he apparently found Deborah specifically because Deborah was findable. She was a police officer, she had a public record. He could locate her through department information and approach her professionally under a cover and work his way into her life from there. The whole architecture of his plan was built on the fact that Dexter had a sister who was findable, which means Harry, in giving Dexter a family and a sister and an embedded normal life, also gave Brian a way in. The protective camouflage of the code and the normal life that Harry built became the mechanism through which Dexter's one true kin found him. There's something about that specific irony that feels very Dexter as a show. The thing meant to protect created the vulnerability. The solution introduced the problem. Every layer of safety turned out to have a gap. About a month after the events of season 1, a diver discovered something in the waters off the coast of Miami. Then divers found more, and more. Eventually, 34 body bags were pulled up from what turned out to be Dexter's main dump site. Dozens of dismembered victims, carefully wrapped and weighted, had been resting on the ocean floor just off the bay. The press called the unknown killer the Bay Harbor Butcher. Miami Metro opened a major investigation, and Sergeant James Dokes, who had always suspected something was deeply wrong with Dexter, started paying very close attention. Dokes is one of the more interesting supporting characters in the show because he's essentially right about everything from the start. He clocks Dexter as a predator before anyone else does, not through any particular investigative breakthrough, but through instinct and pattern recognition. He's seen dangerous people, he knows what they feel like, and Dexter feels like one. The problem for Dokes is that he can't prove it, and his attempts to build a case keep running into the fundamental difficulty of investigating someone who's also a forensics expert embedded in the same department. Dexter knows how crime scenes are processed. He knows what evidence looks like and how to clean it up. He has a legitimate reason to be at crime scenes, to handle evidence, to know exactly what investigators are looking for. Dokes follows him, he photographs him, he eventually catches Dexter in the act, at a cabin in the Everglades where Dexter has been conducting kills. Dexter drugs him, traps him in a cage inside the cabin, and tries to figure out what to do. This is where Lila enters the picture. Lila Tarnay is a British artist Dexter meets through a Narcotics Anonymous group. He's joined NA as a cover story, telling Miami Metro he's attending to work through trauma-related issues. His sponsor pushes him toward Lila. She's damaged and magnetic, and as it emerges over the course of the season, deeply unstable. She becomes obsessed with Dexter. She sees through the performance in ways his other relationships don't allow for. And she finds the darkness underneath not threatening, but fascinating. Dexter has an affair with her, which damages his relationship with Rita. And he keeps telling himself it's a mistake while continuing to make it, which is one of those human things about Dexter that the show gets quietly right. He knows better, he does it anyway. But the critical thing Lila does is find the cabin. She tracks it down through Dexter's files, pieces together what's happening, and drives out there. When she finds Dokes locked in the cage, she doesn't call the police. She burns the cabin down with Dokes inside. She kills him. She eliminates Dexter's biggest threat. And Dexter didn't ask her to. In the immediate aftermath, Dexter frames Dokes as the Bay Harbor Butcher. The evidence is arranged to suggest Dokes had the cabin, conducted the kills, and died in the explosion. Miami Metro closes the investigation. The case is put to bed. From the outside, it looks clean. But Laguerta never believes it. Maria Laguerta, Dexter and Deborah's supervisor at Miami Metro, had a complicated relationship with Dokes. They had history, the exact nature of which shifts slightly depending on which season you're watching. But she cared about him. And she knew him. She knew he wasn't the Bay Harbor butcher because she knew who Dokes was. His history, his psychology, his method. The official story didn't fit the man she knew. She files a dissenting report. She keeps notes. She continues quietly and persistently to believe that Dokes was wrongly identified and that the real butcher is still out there. She doesn't have the evidence to act on it yet, but she's right, and she knows she's right, and she doesn't let it go. That conviction, Laguerta's refusal to accept the official story, is a time bomb. It's set in season 2, and it doesn't detonate until season 7. But it's been ticking the whole time, and when it goes off, it takes several lives with it. Lila, meanwhile, becomes increasingly dangerous. She tries to burn Dexter's apartment with Rita's children inside. She crosses every line she can find. Dexter eventually follows her to Paris and kills her, which is, in the context of this show, the most unambiguously justified kill he probably makes. But the damage she caused to his relationship with Rita, to the integrity of the Bay Harbor butcher investigation, to Dokes, who was an innocent man in the most literal sense, is irreversible. The Dokes framing specifically is one of the more uncomfortable details in this whole section, and I don't think it gets talked about enough. It's one of the few times in the show where Dexter's cover is maintained not through his own actions, but through someone else's. He didn't kill Dokes, he didn't frame him. Lila did both of those things, and Dexter allowed it to stand. He accepted the protection. That complicity, the willingness to let an innocent man's reputation be destroyed to preserve his own secret, tells you something about the limits of the code. The code says don't kill innocents. It doesn't say anything about allowing their posthumous destruction. Rita eventually forgives Dexter, more or less. The relationship recovers. By the end of season 2, they're back together and moving forward. And there's something genuinely warm about that reconciliation, even knowing what's coming. The Bay Harbor butcher case ends officially with Dokes blamed and Dexter free, but LaGuardia kept her notes, and 5 years later, those notes would matter enormously. Season 3 starts with a mistake. Dexter has a target, a dealer named Fred Bowman, who he's been tracking and has confirmed as guilty of serious violence. He finds Bowman in an apartment and moves on him. But there's someone else in the apartment, a young man named Oscar Prado, who stumbles into the situation at the worst possible moment. There's a struggle. Dexter kills Oscar in self-defense, if that phrase can even meaningfully apply here given the circumstances, and only after does he discover who Oscar was. Oscar was the brother of Miguel Prado, assistant district attorney, one of the most prominent and well-connected figures in Miami's legal world. Someone who works in the same building as Miami Metro. Someone Dexter will inevitably encounter in the investigation that follows. The sensible choice here, the move that keeps the code intact and Dexter's exposure minimal, would have been to quietly distance himself from the Prado family and let the investigation run its course without his involvement. He's a blood spatter analyst. He can process the scene professionally and step back. He doesn't do that. Instead, Dexter stays close to Miguel. He attends Oscar's funeral. He checks in on the family. He and Miguel begin spending time together. And somewhere in that proximity, a genuine friendship starts to develop, which is something Dexter has very little experience with. Miguel is charming, sharp, and in his own way, very perceptive. He starts to notice things about Dexter that don't quite add up. He follows a trail. He eventually figures out who killed his brother, and then he figures out what Dexter is more broadly. And his reaction is fascinating because it's not horror, and it's not an attempt to turn Dexter in. It's excitement. Miguel wants in. He frames it as wanting to do good. He's a prosecutor who's watched guilty men walk free for years. He knows the system's limitations intimately. The idea of operating outside those limitations, of being able to deal with people the way Dexter does, appeals to him in a way he can't quite contain. He appeals to Dexter's loneliness, to that same need for recognition that Brian exploited from the other direction. And Dexter, against his better judgment, agrees to teach him. This is the second time in the series that Dexter has allowed someone into his secret because it felt like the closest thing to genuine connection. And as with Brian, the arrangement doesn't hold. Miguel's corruption of the code is gradual at first and then quite sudden. He uses the training and the permission structure to go after Ellen Wolf, a defense attorney who has been a professional thorn in his side. Ellen Wolf is not a killer, she's not a monster, or she's a competent lawyer who does her job well, and that job sometimes involves defending people Miguel finds contemptible. By any reading of the code, she's completely off limits. Miguel kills her anyway, and then he denies it. When Dexter confirms what happened, the friendship ends in the most direct way available to him. He kills Miguel, the man he spent a season trying to befriend, trying to genuinely connect with, is on the table in a kill room before the season is over. The lesson that Dexter consistently fails to learn from Miguel and from Brian before him is that sharing his secret creates a specific kind of vulnerability, because the person he shared it with now has leverage, and leverage is dangerous. Miguel didn't end up using that leverage against Dexter, not effectively, but he could have. And future people who discover the secret, La Guerta in Season 7, most critically, will. There's a subplot this season involving a killer called the Skinner, who is connected to Miguel's world through a different thread. It's not the strongest part of the season, but it runs alongside the main story and gives Dexter some physical danger to navigate alongside the emotional mess of the Miguel situation. And at the very end of Season 3, amid all of this, Dexter and Rita get married. It's a warm scene, genuinely. Rita deserves something good. Dexter, in his way, wants to give it to her. The wedding happens at a beautiful location. Dexter delivers his vows with something that at least resembles real feeling. And for a moment, the show allows you to believe that this might actually work. Rita is also pregnant. Harrison, who will become one of the most important figures in this entire story, is already on the way. So Season 3 ends with a marriage, a death, and a baby coming. And it ends with Dexter having learned again that bringing someone inside his life costs more than he can afford. He just hasn't learned not to keep doing it. If you've seen Dexter, you know what this section is about. Season 4 is where the show is at its best, and it's also where the single most consequential decision in the entire series is made. Arthur Mitchell is a high school art teacher in his 60s. He volunteers at a local charity, Helping Hands. He goes to church. He has a wife and 2 grown children. He's been living in Tampa, Florida for decades. From the outside, he looks like exactly the kind of man that community foundations put in newsletters. He is also the Trinity Killer, a serial killer who has been operating since 1976, and who by the time Dexter finds him in Season 4, has committed somewhere in the region of 200 murders. His kill cycle is extraordinarily specific. A young woman whose femoral artery is sliced in her bathtub, a mother who is driven to jump from a great height, and a father who is bludgeoned to death. Each stage represents a tragedy from Arthur's own family history, a mirror of something that was done to the people around him when he was 10 years old, and which he has been recreating compulsively for 30-odd years. Before each cycle, he buries a young boy in concrete. That one represents himself. Dexter tracks Arthur down through case files that the FBI's Frank Lundy, back in Miami investigating Trinity, has assembled over the years. Lundy is killed mid-season, which is a story in itself, but Dexter finds Arthur first, and then he doesn't kill him. This is the decision. This is the butterfly that causes the storm. Dexter's reason for waiting is something he articulates clearly to himself in internal monologue. He wants to learn from Arthur. Dexter is now a married father of 3 children, struggling enormously with the demands of domestic life alongside his night work. He's overwhelmed. He's distracted, he keeps making errors, and Arthur Mitchell, whatever else he is, has managed to maintain a double life as a family man and a serial killer for nearly 30 years without being caught. Dexter wants to know how, so he creates a fake identity, Kyle Butler, and begins spending time with the Mitchell family. He attends their church, he goes to their home, he watches how Arthur operates. What he discovers fairly quickly is that Arthur's domestic life is held together by fear and cruelty. His wife and children are terrified of him. The warmth he projects in public is a complete performance. He is, as Deborah might say, a monster all the way down. There's nothing in Arthur Mitchell's home life that Dexter can usefully apply to his own situation, but Dexter has already started the process. And once you're inside something like this, with an active serial killer who is becoming suspicious of you, leaving cleanly is not straightforward. There are multiple points during season 4 where Dexter has the opportunity to kill Arthur and doesn't. He stops Arthur from killing himself at one point because if Arthur dies by his own hand, Dexter doesn't get to be the one who does it. That decision, prioritizing his own need to be the one holding the kill above the practical reality that a dead trinity is a problem solved, is such a clear example of the dark passenger overriding sensible judgment that it's hard to watch even knowing it's coming. Arthur eventually figures out that Kyle Butler and Dexter Morgan are the same person. He searches the name online and finds the address. He has Dexter's home address. What happens next is a matter of timing that borders on cruelty in how the show constructs it. Rita and Harrison are supposed to be on a flight to the Florida Keys for a family holiday. Rita returns to the house briefly, alone except for Harrison, to pick up her passport that she forgot. While she's there, Arthur Mitchell comes to the house. Dexter kills Arthur in a kill room that same evening. He feels satisfied, complete. He drives home from the kill feeling for the first time all season like he has things under control. He finds a voicemail from Rita saying she missed the flight and is taking a later one. He finds Harrison in the bathroom. Harrison is sitting on the floor, crying in a pool of his mother's blood. Rita is dead in the bathtub, her femoral artery severed. That's the method Arthur used for the first stage of his kill cycle, a young woman in a bathtub, femoral artery. Rita had 2 children from her previous marriage, which fulfilled the next stage's requirement of a mother of 2. Arthur killed Rita both as an act of personal revenge against Dexter and because she fit his pattern. He improvised the cycle around the opportunity. And Harrison, 1-year-old, sat in his mother's blood on a bathroom floor for however long it took Dexter to arrive. The full circle horror of that image is something the show earns completely. Dexter's origin story begins in blood. His son's begins in blood. The pattern that Harry was so desperate to interrupt in Dexter's childhood has been handed directly to the next generation, through a chain of consequences that started with Dexter choosing to study Arthur Mitchell rather than kill him when he had the chance. Let's just sit with the scope of what this decision caused. Rita is dead. Harrison loses his mother before he's old enough to form a conscious memory of her. Astor and Cody, Rita's children from her first marriage, lose their mother and stepfather in a single catastrophic season. Dexter enters a grief that he barely knows how to process because he's never had reliable access to genuine emotion. And Harrison grows up carrying a trauma that mirrors his father's, which means the dark passenger, or something like it, is essentially seeded in him before he's 2 years old. Season 4 is widely considered the peak of the show, and I think that's right. John Lithgow's performance as Arthur is extraordinary, a genuine portrait of contained menace that never tips into pantomime. Michael C. Hall does some of his best work this season, particularly in the later episodes as the situation spirals. And the finale, the final 10 minutes or so, is as devastating as television gets. But the reason it's devastating is precisely because of everything we've walked through in this section. The tragedy isn't arbitrary. It was built piece by piece by Dexter's choices. He stayed too long. He waited too long. He put his own need to understand Trinity above his family's safety. And the person who paid for it wasn't him. It was Rita, and it was Harrison sitting in that blood. Season 5 begins about 30 seconds after Season 4 ends. Dexter's standing in his bathroom looking at Rita. He calls 911. He says to the operator flatly, "My wife is dead." And then there's the season's first episode, which is mostly about the immediate aftermath, the investigation that has to happen, the children who have lost their mother, the neighbors and the police, and the quiet mechanical process of what follows sudden violent death. It's one of the stronger season openers because it doesn't shy away from the specific texture of grief, including the specific texture of Dexter's grief, which is confused and fragmented and keeps arriving in wrong-shaped moments rather than the smooth, predictable waves you might expect. He loved Rita in the way he could love anyone, which was real if not complete. And losing her this way through a chain of consequences that he can clearly trace back to his own choices creates something in him that the show is careful not to name too cleanly. Aster and Cody go to live with Rita's parents in Orlando. They don't appear much in subsequent seasons, which is a choice the show makes for practical reasons, but which has a slightly odd emotional texture. These children who lost their mother and essentially lost their stepfather too, who aged out of the story because it became inconvenient to include them. Harrison stays with Dexter, and then Dexter encounters Lumen Pierce. Lumen is a woman from Minnesota who came to Miami several months ago under circumstances she hasn't told anyone about. She was abducted by a group of men, assaulted repeatedly, and kept as one of several victims in what becomes known as the Barrel Girls case when the bodies start emerging. She survived, she escaped, but she can't leave. She wants the men who did it to answer for it. Dexter finds her by accident, in the middle of a kill. She's terrified of him. He makes choices that should terrify her more than choices that complicate that terror. And eventually, a relationship develops that is unlike any other in the show. What makes the Lumen dynamic work, at least in the first half of the season, is that there's a complete absence of performance between them. Lumen knows what Dexter is within the first few episodes, and her response isn't horror or manipulation, it's a kind of exhausted, pragmatic acceptance. She needs what he can do. He has become, for complicated reasons, invested in her survival. They work together. And it goes deeper than that. There are scenes between Dexter and Lumen in the quieter moments of the season where he seems more genuinely present than in most of his other relationships. He's not performing normality, she's not expecting it. There's something in the transparency of their arrangement that creates room for something real. The Barrel Girls investigation leads to Jordan Chase, a motivational speaker who is revealed as the organizer and the primary offender. Chase is a slick, self-constructed predator, and Johnny Lee Miller plays him with that particular kind of charm that's very slightly wrong, very slightly off in its calibration. Dexter and Lumen work through the connected offenders until they reach Chase himself, and they kill him together. Deborah, who has been leading the Barrel Girls investigation from the Miami Metro side, tracks them to the scene. She arrives at the kill room, a warehouse filled with plastic sheeting, while Dexter and Lumen are still inside. She can see their silhouettes through the sheeting. She can see that there are two people. She has a gun. She lets them go. She gives them an hour's head start and tells them she needs to call in the scene. She says, not knowing who she's talking to, that she understands, that she's seen the DVDs the men made of their crimes, that whoever the survivor is, whoever is inside that room, she gets it. This is one of Deborah's most quietly significant moments in the entire show. She makes a decision in the field to let vigilante justice stand rather than pursue the technically correct course of action. She does it because she sympathizes with the victim. And she never finds out that one of the two people behind that sheeting was her brother. This near miss matters, and it's worth keeping in mind because it shapes what happens in Season 7. When Deborah eventually discovers the truth about Dexter, her response is not someone confronting something entirely alien. She has already, in this moment, made the moral accommodation. She's already decided that some version of this is acceptable. Her own prior choice makes her less equipped to take the clear-eyed position she might otherwise have taken. Lumen leaves at the end of Season 5. Her need for revenge is satisfied. Her dark passenger, she tells Dexter, is gone. She doesn't have the capacity to do what he does. She was never wired for this. It was circumstantial, and the circumstances have resolved. She thanks him, she goes. And Dexter watches her leave and understands something, though I'm not sure the show lets him fully articulate it. What he had with Lumen was the closest he had come to being fully known, fully accepted, and genuinely cared for since Brian. And it ended, not through betrayal or violence or death, just because she was finished and he wasn't. That particular ache, the experience of genuine connection followed by ordinary loss, might be more destabilizing than anything else that happens to him, because it proves that the connection is possible, it just doesn't last. And there's a specific thing Lumen's departure does to the seasons that follow it that I don't think gets talked about enough. Lumen leaves because she's healed. Her darkness was circumstantial, and it resolved. But Dexter's darkness isn't circumstantial. It isn't going anywhere. And watching someone walk away from what he is, not running in horror, not being destroyed by it, just calmly finishing and leaving, might have clarified something for him that he spends the next 3 seasons trying not to look at directly, which is that the normal life Harry designed for him, the relationships and the job and the embedded social functioning, is not a path to anything. It's maintenance. It buys him time and cover and occasionally something that feels like meaning. But the meaning always leaves or dies or gets used up, and the dark passenger stays. By the time season 7 begins, there's a version of Dexter who has had Brian and Miguel and Lumen and Rita. He's loved in his way all of them. They're all gone. What remains is the code, the kills, and Deborah, who's about to find out everything. The show earned that stripped-back situation, even if Season 6 was a rocky road to get there. Season 6 is widely considered the weakest of the original run. The critical reception at the time was fairly unkind, and most of the specific complaints are pretty fair. The main villain plot is heavy-handed, the religious symbolism is applied with a broad brush, and some of the character decisions don't quite ring true. The show's showrunner had changed after season 4, and the loss of Clyde Phillips, who left to spend more time with his family after delivering the Trinity season, is palpable. But season 6 matters enormously in the butterfly effect conversation, because its final moment is one of the most significant single images in the entire series. The season's central antagonists are the Doomsday Killers, Professor James Geller, and his student Travis Marshall. They're staging elaborate murder tableau based on the Book of Revelation, which is exactly as much fun as that description makes it sound. Geller is played by Edward James Olmos and Travis by Colin Hanks, and there's a twist mid-season that changes the dynamic between them, though I won't get into the specifics because it's one of the season's few genuinely effective moments, and it's worth experiencing fresh if you haven't seen it. What matters is the final episode. Travis Marshall, having survived everything up to that point, kidnaps Harrison for a final religious tableau. Dexter rescues Harrison. He tracks Travis to a church. He brings Travis to a kill room inside the church, ties him to the altar, and prepares to kill him. Deborah Morgan, who has been following the Doomsday case for Miami Metro, and who has been in therapy all season working through her complicated feelings about her relationship with Dexter, comes to the church. She's tracking the case. She's following a lead. She walks through the door. She sees Dexter standing over Travis. She sees him raise the knife. She watches him kill Travis Marshall. They look at each other. Dexter says, "Oh God." Season 6 ends. That's the moment. A door opened at the wrong time. Or maybe the right time, depending on how you look at it. The thing about this reveal is that it wasn't accidental in any meaningful way. Deborah was always going to find out eventually. The Bay Harbor butcher case was still out there. LaGuardia was still quietly holding her conviction that Dokes was innocent. The bloodslide were in Dexter's apartment. The pattern of dead bodies that followed Dexter around had become, over 6 seasons, genuinely difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence for anyone paying close enough attention. The question was never really if, but when and how. and the how matters. Deborah didn't find documentary evidence in an orderly way with time to think. She walked in and saw the thing happening. She witnessed it in real time, in a church, with a ritualistic quality to the setting that added an extra layer of psychological weight. That experience, the live witnessing of violence rather than the intellectual discovery of facts, shapes everything about how she processes it. It's also worth noting where Deborah was emotionally at the end of season 6. She had just been in therapy, ostensibly working through a complicated mix of feelings about Dexter that her therapist had suggested included something more than sibling attachment. That thread is handled, as I mentioned earlier, with something less than grace by the writers. But the underlying emotional architecture is real. Deborah's feelings about Dexter are layered and not entirely rational, and they make her less equipped to respond with clear professional judgment to what she's just seen. Season 7 is going to ask a lot of her, and the fact that she saw it like this, viscerally and without preparation, is what makes her response in Season 7 the specific shape that it is. There's also a small note worth making about what Season 6 did to Harrison, because the kidnapping episode is not exactly treated as a major trauma in the immediate aftermath. The show moves on fairly quickly. But a child who is kidnapped by a serial killer for use in a murder ritual, even a very young child, carries that. And Harrison's arc in New Blood connects directly to a childhood full of exactly these kinds of events happening around him. So Season 6, for all its structural weaknesses, lands the one thing it absolutely needed to land, that final image. Deborah in the doorway, Dexter over the body, the two of them looking at each other across what has just become an uncrossable line. Everything that happens in the next 2 seasons is a consequence of that unlocked door. Season 7 picks up immediately after Season 6 ends, which is the right move. This is not a situation that benefits from an ellipsis. Deborah follows Dexter out of the church. She asks him what she just saw. He tries to deflect. She doesn't let him. And over the first few episodes of Season 7, Dexter tells Deborah the truth. Not all at once, not cleanly, and with some significant things still held back for as long as possible. But the essential truth, he is the Bay Harbor Butcher. He has been killing for decades, and he kills according to a code that targets people who have escaped the justice system. Deborah's response to this is worth spending some time on, because it's not what you might expect. She doesn't call it in, she doesn't go to Captain Matthews or the FBI or anyone with the ability to actually act on this information. She doesn't end her relationship with Dexter. She sits with it in a state of genuine psychological distress that the show captures well, and eventually she moves into a position of protective complicity. She decides that she is going to try to help Dexter stop, or at least control what he does, and that she's going to keep the secret. This decision destroys her, not immediately, but progressively and thoroughly. And the mechanism of its destruction is already in motion on a separate track because Lagerta has found something. A bloodslide. Left at the church where Travis Marshall was killed. LaGuerta finds it during her own review of the crime scene and recognizes it as the signature of the Bay Harbor Butcher. Not Dokes' signature, someone else's. And this time she has something concrete to take to her superiors. LaGuerta reopens the Bay Harbor Butcher case. She works it carefully and methodically, building a case that points toward Dexter. She brings Deborah into the investigation at one point, trying to use her as an ally, not knowing that Deborah is already protecting the person she's investigating. The season's other major plots, a confrontation with Ukrainian mobster Isaac Serko, who has a personal vendetta against Dexter, and Dexter's developing a relationship with Hannah McKay, a botanist and former accomplice of a spree killer, run alongside the Lagerta investigation. Hannah is interesting because she's genuinely dangerous and Dexter falls for her anyway, which is very Dexter. She poisons Deborah at one point, which further strains the already badly strained relationship between the siblings. But the season's climax is in a shipping container in a boatyard. LaGuerta has gathered enough evidence to compel Deborah to meet her there. She has a gun on Deborah. She wants Dexter. She knows Deborah knows where he is. Dexter is there behind LaGuerta. He has a syringe. The situation is a box with one viable exit. LaGuerta is not going to back down. She's been right about this for 5 years, and she knows it, and she's not going to let the last real chance to prove it walk out of a boatyard. Deborah shoots LaGuerta. She shoots her own boss. She kills the person whose career she built her own career alongside. She kills an innocent woman to protect her brother. And this is the moment that everything in Deborah's story has been building toward. Going all the way back to season 1, when Brian dated her to get to Dexter. Every time Dexter's life touched hers, it cost her something. Her relationships, her professional credibility at various points, her emotional health, her self-image. And now it cost her this. LaGuerta's death is covered up. It's staged to look like a mutual kill and some sort of confrontation with an unrelated suspect. The investigation into the Bay Harbor butcher closes again. The official story holds, more or less, but Deborah is different now. Something fundamental has changed. She quit Miami Metro and took a job as a private investigator, unable to put on the badge after what she did. She drank heavily. She almost confessed to Quinn in a moment of drunk candor, and Quinn didn't believe her, which is the only reason the cover didn't fall apart right then. She went through a sustained period of self-destruction that the show depicts honestly, if briefly. When she reconciles with Dexter in season 8, it's not because she's healed, it's because she's accepted the reality of who her brother is and decided after everything that she still loves him. That acceptance doesn't fix what was broken. It just puts her back in proximity to the thing that broke her. Deborah Morgan is, in many ways, the show's most tragic figure. Not because of what was done to her, though plenty was, but because of what she chose. She had opportunities to step away from Dexter's orbit, to prioritize her own safety and sanity, and she didn't take them because family meant too much, because Dexter meant too much. And every time she came back, the cost went up. LaGuerta's death is the highest that cost ever goes in the original series. And the line from that boatyard back to 1973 is absolutely direct. Harry adopted Dexter, Harry trained Dexter, Dexter killed Brian, Dexter framed Dokes, LaGuerta doubted the frame, LaGuerta found the blood slide at the church, LaGuerta reopened the case, Deborah pulled the trigger. Butterfly, storm, simple as that. Season 8 is the most divisive season of the show, and most of the criticism is legitimate. The villain doesn't land the way the previous best season's villains did. Some of the character choices feel unmotivated. The pacing is uneven. And the finale, which we'll get to, has gone down in TV history as one of the more frustrating endings a well-loved show has produced. But there are things season 8 gets right, and they matter for the butterfly effect conversation. Chief among them is Dr. Evelyn Vogel. Vogel arrives in Dexter's life as a neuropsychiatrist who has taken an interest in a new series of killings in Miami. This one involving brain material being removed from victims and presented to her. She comes to Dexter for help, and fairly quickly it becomes apparent that she already knows who and what he is. She knows because she helped create him. Specifically, she helped Harry construct the code. Back when Harry was trying to figure out what to do with the small, damaged, increasingly dangerous boy he'd adopted, he consulted Vogel. She was a specialist in psychopathy, with an unconventional view that psychopaths could be stabilized and even made socially useful if their tendencies were properly channeled. Harry described Dexter's situation to her in enough detail that she understood exactly what they were dealing with. She helped Harry design the framework. She advised on which rules would be functional and which wouldn't. The code, in other words, has always been at least partly hers. Dexter's reaction to this revelation is interesting. He doesn't dismiss it or rage at it. He absorbs it. But there's something in the revelation that subtly destabilizes his relationship to the code, because the code has always functioned as Harry's gift to him. A piece of fatherly wisdom, something personal and handed down. Discovering that it was partly a clinical exercise by a professional who saw him as a case study takes some of the warmth out of it. Vogel's biological son, Oliver Saxon, is the brain surgeon. He's responsible for the killings that brought her to Dexter's attention. And he is, in the show's framing, what Dexter might have been without the code. Completely unconstrained, without rules, with no interest in controlling or directing his impulses. He's genuinely menacing in early episodes, though the season doesn't always make the most of him. The dynamic between Dexter, Vogel, and Saxon is complicated by genuine affection. Dexter comes to care about Vogel in a way that feels similar to how he cared about Harry. She represents a kind of intellectual parenthood, and when Saxon kills her, it's a real loss rather than a plot mechanism, which is something Season 8 doesn't always manage. And then Dexter does the thing again. Dexter captures Saxon. He has him. He's ready to kill him, but he decides to leave Saxon in Deborah's hands instead. His reasoning is partly selfless. He wants Deborah to have a clean, professional win, a high-profile arrest that will restore some of what she lost when she left Miami Metro. He's planning to leave Miami anyway, to go to Argentina with Hannah and Harrison and start over. Leaving Saxon alive feels like a generous act. It is, in fact, the same mistake he made with Trinity, just less dramatically framed. He spares someone he should kill because his attention has moved on to something else. Saxon escapes through a legal technicality. He tracks down Deborah, who has returned to Miami Metro and who is working to bring him in. He shoots her in the abdomen. Deborah survives the initial surgery. The prognosis looks reasonable. And then a blood clot forms, and she slips into a coma, and she is declared brain dead. Dexter makes the final decision. He takes Deborah off life support. He carries her out of the hospital in the middle of a hurricane. He takes her on the boat, the Slice of Life, the same boat he's used for decades to transport his victims out to the Gulf Stream. And he does with her what he's done with all of them. He rolls her into the ocean, then he drives the boat into the hurricane. He is trying to die. He doesn't die. He washes up somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. He finds work as a lumberjack. He assumes the name Jim Lindsay, which is a small in-joke for fans of the novels, Jim Lindsay being a nod to Jeff Lindsay, who wrote the original Dexter books. He lives alone in a remote community in Oregon. He suppresses the dark passenger. For almost 10 years, he doesn't kill. Harrison is in Argentina with Hannah. His father has abandoned him a second time. His mother died when he was a baby. His adoptive stepmother died when he was a baby. His aunt, the closest thing to a parent he had through his childhood, is dead. The person who is meant to protect him has vanished. The ending of the original series is widely disliked, and I think the main reason is that it refuses to pay off any of the emotional debts it has spent 8 years accumulating. Dexter doesn't die. He doesn't face consequences. He disappears into a beard and a flannel shirt, and the camera lingers on his face, and it's supposed to mean something. It doesn't quite, not in isolation, but it means more once you know what comes next. Because the series didn't end. Not really. Dexter, New Blood aired in late 2021, almost 10 years after the original series finale, and it's set in Iron Lake, New York, which if you've spent 8 seasons watching Dexter sweat in Miami is a significant change. Iron Lake is cold, it's quiet, it's surrounded by woods and snow and a close-knit community where everyone knows everyone, which is exactly the wrong kind of place to hide if you are, in fact, one of the most prolific serial killers in American history who is technically deceased. Dexter's living there as Jim Lindsay. He's been in Iron Lake for several years. He has a job at the local hunting and sporting goods store. He has a girlfriend, Angela Bishop, who is the town's police chief. He seems settled, even peaceful. He's been suppressing the dark passenger for a long time, and it seems to be working. It's not working. A local man named Kurt Caldwell, who runs a trucking business and is very popular in the community, has been killing runaways and young women passing through the area for years. His murders are methodical and hidden, and he's been operating completely under the radar. When some of this starts to surface, Dexter, who cannot help himself, begins investigating. He kills again. The mask slips a little at first, then more, then completely. And then Harrison arrives. Harrison Morgan is now a teenager. He's been in Argentina with Hannah, and then Hannah apparently got sick and died off screen between the original series and New Blood, which feels a bit abrupt, but there it is. Harrison has been moving around, dealing with things as best he can, and he has tracked down Dexter through a combination of determination and the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. Harrison is damaged. He's been hurting himself, a physical expression of something internal that he can't articulate. He has impulses he doesn't understand. He's been fighting at school, gravitating toward violence in ways that alarm the people around him. And he has come to find his father, the one person who might understand what's happening inside him, because Harrison has started to suspect that whatever his father is, he might be it too. The reunion between Dexter and Harrison is one of New Blood's stronger threads. It's tentative and complicated, and neither of them is fully honest with the other for a long time. Dexter tries to be a father in the functional sense, to provide stability and guidance, while simultaneously hiding the fact that he's killed again. Harrison tries to build a relationship with this man who abandoned him, while navigating his own internal landscape, which is darker than he knows how to explain. Angela Bishop, meanwhile, is doing what good detectives do. She's paying attention. She starts noticing things about Jim Lindsay that don't add up. She connects Jim to the Bay Harbor butcher case through some cross-referencing that starts with a different investigation altogether. She figures out that Jim Lindsay is Dexter Morgan, and she figures out that Dexter Morgan is the Bay Harbor butcher. Kurt Caldwell's story ends when Dexter kills him, but it's not clean. Nothing in New Blood is clean. Harrison finds out about the kill. The pretense of the new life collapses. Dexter and Harrison have the conversation they've been circling since Harrison arrived. What Dexter is, what the dark passenger is, and whether Harrison has one too. Harrison does. He's been aware of it. He's been terrified of it. And the discovery that his father has spent decades channeling something similar through a code, through rules, through directed violence towards bad people, doesn't comfort him the way Dexter seems to hope it will. Harrison has watched what the dark passenger has done to the people around his father. Rita, Deborah, all of them. He's not interested in a version of that life. Dexter kills Logan, a local police officer, in the process of trying to escape. Logan had nothing to do with any of this. He was just in the way. And it's the first clear violation of the code that Harrison witnesses directly. Angela confronts the situation. There's no clean way out for Dexter this time. He has killed a police officer in a small town where the police chief knows who he is and has assembled a case against him. Harrison has a rifle. Harrison shoots Dexter. The show frames this as Harrison's choice. Not a moment of rage, not an accident, a decision. He looks at his father and he sees everything that the dark passenger has caused, everyone it has consumed, and he decides that he won't be next. He won't be the next person in Dexter Morgan's orbit to be destroyed by proximity. Whether it's justice, mercy, or patricide is left for the audience to sit with. In the show's logic, all three interpretations hold. The full circle is almost literary in its construction. Dexter's story began with a child sitting in blood in an enclosed space waiting to be found. It ends with the child of that man making the decision to end the cycle. Harrison was formed in blood the same way Dexter was. And Harrison's response to that formation is the opposite of the codes. He doesn't redirect the dark urge, he refuses it, or at least that's what New Blood says. What Dexter, Resurrection, which started airing in 2025, says about this is a different matter, and suggests the story is not yet finished. But as an ending to the butterfly effect chain, Harrison shooting Dexter is the most structurally elegant conclusion the franchise has produced. It's the storm arriving at last from a wing beat in 1973. We're getting into the later part of the evening now, and this is the section where we can slow down a bit and let things breathe. The what-ifs. Because if you trace a butterfly effect chain as long as this one, the natural next question is, Where were the moments where a different choice would have changed everything? Where were the genuine forks? And Dexter is unusually rich in these, partly because the show's structure is built around a character who makes a recognizable type of bad decision over and over again. It's not random chaos that drives the tragedy. It's a consistent pattern, which means you can identify the specific points where things could have gone differently. Let's start with the earliest one. What if Harry had taken Dexter to a psychiatrist rather than constructing the code? This is the deepest what if because it goes furthest back. Childhood trauma, the right therapeutic intervention at the right time, can be genuinely transformative. Not always and not in every case, but the idea that a traumatized 3-year-old with developing psychopathic tendencies was irredeemably beyond help is Harry's assumption, not a clinical conclusion. Harry made a unilateral decision based on his own assessment of the situation, and he didn't have the expertise to make that assessment reliably. A different Harry, one who trusted the process, might have involved child psychiatrists early, might have got Dexter into treatment, might have monitored the situation with professional support rather than trying to manage it alone. And maybe the dark passenger still emerges anyway. The trauma was real. The underlying neurological profile might not have been changeable regardless. But maybe not. Maybe with the right help, a different Dexter exists. One who doesn't kill at all, or who kills far less, or who lives a life that doesn't leave a trail of broken people in its wake. Brian is the more haunting version of this question, because Brian got none of the structure that Dexter had. No code, no Harry, no framework at all. And Brian became what he became, which might suggest that Harry's intervention, for all its flaws, was genuinely better than nothing. The comparison between the brothers is the show's most direct piece of evidence that Harry's approach, however flawed, worked in the narrow sense of producing a more controlled and functional person. Though arguably Brian was also more honest. What if Dexter had gone with Brian at the end of season 1? This one is interesting because it's the road not taken that the show glances at, and then decisively closes off. If Dexter had killed Deborah and left with Brian, the show would have had to become a completely different thing. Two brothers operating together, fully embracing what they are. Brian is the only person in the whole series who offers Dexter a version of genuine acceptance without the caveat of expected change. The downstream consequences are easier to imagine on one track. The Bay Harbor butcher investigation eventually ends without a resolution. Dokes retires never having proved his suspicions. Miami Metro never finds the truth. But on another track, without the code, without Harry's structure, two unregulated killers operating together would presumably have escalated in ways that eventually made them impossible to conceal. Harry's training kept Dexter functional partly by keeping him controlled. Without it, the story might have run shorter and louder. What if Lila hadn't killed Dokes? This is perhaps the most structurally pivotal what if in the whole show, because it's the one where the mechanism of consequence is clearest. If Lila doesn't burn that cabin, Dokes survives. If Dokes survives, there is no framing opportunity. Dexter gets caught. The Bay Harbor butcher is identified as Dexter Morgan. The show ends in season 2. Rita lives. Harrison is born to a mother who survives. Deborah's career proceeds normally. LaGuerta never needs to spend 5 years privately doubting the official story because there's no official story to doubt. Everything from season 3 onwards, every kill, every relationship, every broken life is contingent on Lila making one specific decision in the Everglades. And she makes it because she is obsessive and possessive and determined to remove any obstacle between herself and Dexter. She doesn't do it to protect Dexter in the straightforward sense. She does it because Dokes represents a problem and eliminating the problem suits her. The person who saved Dexter in season 2 was arguably the most dangerous person he ever got close to. What if Dexter had killed Trinity when he first had the opportunity? We talked about this in depth in section 6, so we don't need to go back over the mechanics. But the what-if version is worth sitting with in a slightly different frame. Rita lives. That one is straightforward. If Trinity dies early in season 4, Before he can track down Dexter's home address, Rita continues her life. She and Dexter raise Harrison together. Astor and Cody grow up with their mother. The family that Dexter built continues, imperfect and strained and not entirely real, but intact. Harrison's childhood is different, not necessarily uncomplicated because Dexter is still who he is, and the risks don't disappear. But Harrison doesn't have the blood-soaked bathroom as his foundational experience. Whatever darkness he might carry, he's not primed to carry it the same way. Deborah doesn't lose Rita as a sister-in-law and friend. LaGuardia's investigation still happens because her dissatisfaction with the Dokes cover-up predates Season 4. So that clock is still ticking regardless. But in terms of immediate consequences, a different Season 4 ending is the single biggest fork in the road. Everything that drives Seasons 5 through 8, and then new blood flows from Rita's death. Remove Rita's death and the emotional engine of the rest of the show is completely different. What if Deborah hadn't walked into the church? The short answer is delayed, not prevented. LaGuardia was already getting close. The blood slide from the church gave her something concrete, but she was building a case regardless. If Deborah walks in 30 seconds later or earlier and never sees what she sees, the Season 7 investigation still happens. It might have gone differently without Deborah's involvement and with LaGuardia operating on a cleaner investigative track, but it would have happened. The difference is that without Deborah witnessing the kill directly, her psychology around the situation would have been different. She would have been confronted with evidence rather than experience. That's a meaningful distinction. Evidence can be argued with. An image you've seen with your own eyes is harder to negotiate around. What if Dexter had killed Saxon? Deborah lives. That's the simple version. If Dexter doesn't spare Saxon for the complex mixture of reasons we went through in Section 10, Saxon doesn't escape, doesn't find Deborah, doesn't shoot her. She survives. She's already in a fragile state, and her relationship with Dexter is complicated in ways that might never fully resolve. But she's alive, and if Deborah is alive, the ending of the original series is different. The show presumably finds another way to close, but Dexter driving into a hurricane out of guilt and self-loathing is not the mechanism. Of all the what-ifs, this one bothers me most, because it's so clearly a repeat of the Trinity mistake. Dexter spares someone he should kill. That person kills someone Dexter loves. The show even seems aware of the parallel. It just asks you to watch it happen twice. One last what-if, and this one is more speculative. What if Harrison had made a different choice in New Blood? If Harrison doesn't pull the trigger, Dexter presumably gets arrested. Angela has the case. He goes to trial, maybe, or he escapes somehow and the cycle continues. The franchise had been moving toward Harrison as the next chapter, so Dexter surviving would have required a different New Blood ending and a different setup for resurrection. But I find myself more interested in the emotional version of this what if. What if Harrison had gone with Dexter? What if, instead of refusing the pattern, he had accepted it the way Dexter accepted Harry's code? What does a Harrison with a code look like? Is it possible for someone to carry this kind of legacy and come out the other side of it differently? Dexter, Resurrection seems to be exploring some version of these questions, and I'm curious to see where it goes. But as a what if, it gets at the central question of the whole franchise. Is any of this inherited, and if so, can it be redirected? Harry believed it could be. He was wrong about the cost of trying. And underneath all of those specific what-ifs, there's a broader one that the show is always circling without quite asking directly. What if someone had just told the truth at any point along the way? What if Harry had told Dexter clearly and without the code as a filter that what Dexter had inside him was dangerous and needed to be addressed rather than directed? What if Dexter had told Deborah years before she walked in on him in the church, rather than leaving her to find out in the worst possible way? What if Deborah had gone to her superiors when she first knew, rather than adding herself to the list of people managing Dexter's secret? The code is, in its own way, a machine for keeping the truth hidden. That's its purpose. Don't get caught means don't let anyone fully know what you are. The whole architecture of Dexter's life is built around concealment. and concealment means that everyone who cares about him is loving a version of him that isn't complete. The what-ifs are really a single what-if in different clothes. What if the people around Dexter had been allowed to actually know him? What would they have done with that knowledge? The show's answer seems to be that the knowledge is fatal. Every person who really knows Dexter either dies or is destroyed by the knowing. Brian, Miguel, Lila, Dokes in a sense, Lagerta, Deborah. The list of people for whom full knowledge of Dexter Morgan proves incompatible with survival is long. Maybe the code wasn't just protection from the outside world. Maybe it was also protection for the people inside Dexter's life, from the full weight of what he actually was. Whether that protection was ultimately worth the cost of never being known is the question the show asks and doesn't answer. I'm not sure there is an answer, really. That's what makes it a good show. And that's perhaps the most honest thing to say about Dexter as a whole. It's a show that asks large questions and lives in the discomfort of not having clean answers. Is a killer who only kills killers doing something defensible? Is a father who trains his son for violence protecting him or destroying him? Is a sister who covers for her brother's crimes committing loyalty or complicity? Is a code that keeps you functional the same thing as a conscience? The show never settles any of these. It just keeps turning them over, season after season, and trusting you to hold the weight of them alongside it. We've been following the main chain closely, tracing the big decisions and the catastrophic consequences. But there's a whole other layer to the butterfly effect conversation in Dexter, which is what happens to the people who weren't the main characters, the supporting cast, the ones who got caught in the edges of Dexter's story and came out different for it. Dokes is the most obvious example, and we've already covered him. He was right about everything, and it cost him his life and his reputation. The Bay Harbor butcher case closes with his name on it. His family, however briefly glimpsed in the show, gets that legacy. A decorated police sergeant framed posthumously as one of the most prolific serial killers in Florida history. That's what Dexter's survival cost, Dokes. Then there's Quinn. Joey Quinn arrives in season 3 as a new detective at Miami Metro, and he's immediately suspicious of Dexter in a way that echoes Dokes without quite having Dokes' intensity. Quinn spends a good portion of season 5 actually building a case, hiring a corrupt former officer named Stan Liddy to surveil Dexter. He gets close, Liddy gets closer, Dexter discovers the surveillance and kills Liddy, leaving no connection back to Quinn. Quinn becomes a suspect in Liddy's disappearance briefly, which complicates his professional life and his relationship with Deborah significantly. He had been in love with Deborah. She breaks things off partly over his investigation into Dexter, though the reasons between them are characteristically tangled. They have an on-again, off-again relationship that runs across multiple seasons without fully resolving. What's interesting about Quinn is that he never fully pursues the Dexter thread again after the Liddy situation. He has enough of a case to keep going, but the personal fallout stops him. He's been right in the same way Dokes was right. He just doesn't pay the same price for it. His story, such as it is, continues into later seasons with diminishing narrative significance. But the shape of it, a man who saw something true and couldn't prove it, is a miniature version of the same tragedy Dokes lived. Then there are Rita's children, Aster and Cody, who are perhaps the most quietly troubling collateral in the show because they're children. And the show doesn't really grapple with what happens to them. They lose their mother in season 4, they go to live with Rita's parents. They effectively exit the narrative at that point and are mentioned only occasionally afterward. 2 children lost their mother because of a choice Dexter made. The show acknowledges this but doesn't sit with it long. Aster and Cody are real casualties of the Trinity decision, just as much as Rita was. Their grief, their disrupted childhoods, the absence of a mother throughout their adolescence, that's all part of what Dexter's delay cost. Angel Batista is a different kind of casualty, less dramatically but persistently affected. He spends the entire series as Dexter's trusted colleague, working alongside him on cases that Dexter is simultaneously exploiting for his own purposes. He gets promoted to lieutenant later in the series, and he's a genuinely good detective and a decent person. He has no idea what Dexter is, not a clue across the whole run, which means every case he worked with Dexter, every commendation and solved crime and professional relationship has an asterisk on it that he doesn't know is there. There's something a bit sad about Batista. He's one of the show's warmest presences. He married LaGuardia briefly, which ended badly. He cared about Dokes and never really accepted the Bay Harbor butcher framing, though he didn't pursue it the way LaGuardia did. And he goes through the entire series with a close friendship to someone who is using his proximity and his goodwill to operate a secret murder practice. Frank Lundy, the FBI agent played by Keith Carradine, deserves a mention because his story illustrates a specific kind of collateral damage. He comes to Miami in Season 2 to investigate the Bay Harbor butcher, gets close to an identification of Dexter, and is pulled away before he can make the case. He returns in Season 4 pursuing the Trinity killer, retired from the FBI now, and working the case informally. He's shot and killed mid-season by Trinity's daughter Christine, who is trying to protect her father's secret. Lundy's death is directly connected to Dexter's existence in the following way. Lundy's investigation of Trinity was motivated partly by the unresolved work of the Bay Harbor butcher case. He came back because he couldn't let it go, and the Trinity killer's peripheral network, specifically Christine, killed him for getting close. If there's no Bay Harbor butcher, if Dexter doesn't exist, Lundy presumably lives out a quieter retirement. Christine Hill is worth a brief note too because her story is one of the show's most tragic background elements. She's the illegitimate daughter Arthur Mitchell fathered and largely abandoned. She's spent her adult life in contact with him, craving his acknowledgement, doing increasingly dangerous things to try to earn his approval. She becomes a reporter, she feeds him information from the investigation, she kills Lundy. And Arthur, when confronted with evidence of what she's done, essentially denies knowing her to protect himself. She takes her own life in police custody when she understands what he's done to her. Christine's entire tragic arc is a downstream consequence of Arthur Mitchell existing as the Trinity killer. And Arthur Mitchell, in the show's accounting, is partly Dexter's responsibility because Dexter kept him alive long enough to keep doing damage. Arthur killed Lundy after Dexter's first encounters with him. If Dexter had followed the code and killed Trinity on schedule, Lundy might have lived, and Christine's story might have ended differently. The web keeps expanding the more you look at it. There's also the Mitchell family itself, Arthur's wife Sally and their adult children Jonah and Rebecca, who spent decades in a household of controlled terror and abuse. They weren't killed by Trinity, but they were profoundly damaged by him. Jonah eventually killed his own mother in a rage, an echo of Arthur's violence passing to the next generation, which mirrors the Harrison-Dexter relationship in a way the show seems aware of. These are people whose suffering extended well beyond Arthur's death because the damage a person like Arthur does to a family doesn't end when he does. And then there's Hannah McKay, who comes into Dexter's life in Season 7 and ends up in Argentina with Harrison. She's a former accomplice of a spree killer who found a different way to use her capacity for violence. And she genuinely loves Dexter and cares for Harrison. She dies off-screen between the original series and New Blood, which the show treats as a narrative convenience, but which represents another person whose life was altered by proximity to Dexter's orbit. Harrison grew up with Hannah after Dexter disappeared, which means the person who raised him for most of his formative years was also, in her own history, someone who had killed. That's the environment Harrison came of age in. Not through any particular fault of Hannah's, who seems to have genuinely tried to do right by him, but as a consequence of the circumstances Dexter created by abandoning his son. None of these people are the main story, but they're all touched by the same chain of cause and effect. Santos Jimenez killed Laura Moser, Harry adopted Dexter, Harry trained him, and the ripples from those three events reached Frank Lundy and Christine Hill and Angel Batista and Quinn and Hannah and Astor and Cody and dozens of unnamed victims, both of Dexter's targets and of the situations his existence generated. The butterfly effect doesn't operate in a single clean line. It fans out, it keeps fanning. Every person it touches becomes a small new center, sending their own ripples into the lives around them. Deborah's destruction affects Quinn, who never quite recovers the thread of what he almost had with her. LaGuardia's death affects Batista, who carries the loss quietly through the remaining seasons. Harrison's abandonment affects Hannah, who raises someone else's damaged child alone until she can't anymore. The show couldn't follow all of those threads. It had enough trouble following its own. But they exist, running alongside the main story, invisible but real. Dexter Morgan is the stone dropped in the water, and the water kept moving long after the stone hit the bottom. There's one element of Dexter's methodology that I want to spend some time with because it's small enough to pass unnoticed, but it's present throughout the entire show, and it connects to the butterfly effect conversation in a way that I find genuinely interesting. The blood slides. After each kill, Dexter takes a blood slide. He presses a drop of the victim's blood between two small rectangles of glass, labels it, and keeps it in a wooden box. The collection grows across the seasons. By the time LaGuerta finds a slide at the church in season 7, the box presumably has dozens of them. These slides are evidence. They are, in the most literal possible sense, a personal collection of every crime Dexter has committed, physically stored in his apartment. And he keeps them there deliberately. He takes them out and looks at them. They represent his kills, his history, his identity as a predator. The code says never get caught. The slides say, I was here, I did this, I am accountable to something even if no one else can see it. I've thought about this detail a lot, and I think what it communicates about Dexter is something the show is smart enough to leave implicit rather than explaining. He keeps the slides because on some level he needs them, not as trophies in the conventional serial killer sense, not as an expression of pride or contempt for the people he's killed, more as a kind of private record, an acknowledgement that these things happened, that the people were real. There's something in Dexter that wants to be known, even if it can't allow itself to be known. The slides are the closest thing to a confession he has. They're also, of course, the thing that almost gets him caught multiple times. The slide left at the church in season 7 is the most direct example, but throughout the series there are moments where the collection represents a risk that a truly code-compliant Dexter would have eliminated. Harry's code is silent on trophies. Harry never told him not to keep them, which might be an oversight, or might be a reflection of Harry's own incomplete understanding of what he was building. Vogel has the most interesting reaction to the slides when she learns about them. She's not alarmed. She interprets the collection as psychologically necessary, a means of maintaining connection to his kills, of processing them, of giving them a place in his identity. Which is probably right. But it also means the woman who helped design the code actively accepts one of the code's most dangerous loopholes. The slides make an appearance in New Blood too, in a way that tracks with the emotional logic of the character. Dexter in Iron Lake as Jim Lindsay is living without the box. He's suppressing the collection along with everything else. When the dark passenger re-emerges, the box re-emerges with it. It's not a coincidence. There's a parallel with the blood slides that becomes most visible in the show's final stretch, and it's this. Dexter's victims are preserved in that box, but Dexter himself is preserved in the people around him. Deborah carries him. Harrison carries him. Angela, by the end of New Blood, carries the weight of what he's done. The people in his life are the living equivalent of those slides. They hold the record of who he was and what his existence produced. And unlike the slides, those people can't be locked in a box and stored in a drawer. There's something else worth saying about the way the show uses blood as a visual and thematic element, and this connects back to the beginning in a way that feels intentional. The original Trauma, 1973, is fundamentally about blood. Dexter in blood, Brian in blood, Laura Moser's blood on the floor, Harry finding the boys and the blood, the shipping container. Blood is the show's central image, from the morning routine in the title sequence, which depicts Dexter's ordinary domestic activities in a way that keeps suggesting violence through the color and texture of things, to the final image of Rita in season 4, to Harrison sitting on the floor in New Blood while Dexter bleeds out. The show's title is written in blood red. The blood slides are his secret identity in miniature. His profession is literally blood analysis. He's surrounded by blood his entire life in ways that both echo his origin and cement his purpose. It's one of those thematic choices that works all the way through without ever being over-explained. The show trusts you to notice it. And the blood slides specifically, those tiny glass rectangles with their single drops, are the closest the show comes to Dexter acknowledging the full weight of what he is. He doesn't grieve for his victims, not in any conventional sense, but he keeps them, he keeps a piece of them, in a dark, quiet way that might be the most human thing about him. Harry didn't put that in the code. Dexter arrived at it on his own. And that's important because it means there are parts of Dexter that Harry didn't shape. The kills were Harry's design. The trophies were Dexter's. The ritual of it, the plastic wrap and the kill rooms and the careful disposal in the Gulf Stream, that was Harry. The box of blood slides, the keeping of evidence, the need to hold on to something of each person he killed, that was Dexter alone. It's a small distinction that says quite a lot. Harry built a killer who wouldn't get caught. Dexter built inside that framework something that also needed to be remembered. The code is about practical survival. The slides are about something that doesn't fit neatly into any framework at all. One more thread before we come in for landing. And it's the one I find most affecting, not necessarily because it's the best written, but because of what it says about the whole project. Throughout New Blood, there are scenes between Dexter and Harrison that are trying to figure out the same question from two different angles. Harrison wants to know if what he carries is the same as what Dexter carries, and Dexter wants to know if there's a version of the code that would work for Harrison the way the code worked for him. If he can pass on the thing Harry passed to him and have it go better this time. This is so classically human that it almost hurts. The impulse to find a way to make the inheritance useful. To take the thing that damaged you and reframe it as something that could protect someone you love. Harry did it with Dexter. Dexter tries to do it with Harrison. The specific contents of what's being passed on are extraordinarily dark, but the structure of the attempt is completely recognizable. What's different about Harrison, though, is that he grew up seeing the wreckage. Dexter was 3 years old when his trauma happened. He had no context for it, no frame. Harry arrived and built the whole framework around him before he was old enough to ask questions. Harrison didn't get that. Harrison grew up watching people around him die or disappear, growing up with Hannah while his father was a ghost in the woods somewhere, old enough to understand what absence means and why it kept happening. He arrived in Iron Lake already knowing something was very wrong. He just didn't know the specifics yet. That's a meaningful difference. Dexter accepted the code because he had nothing to compare it against. Harrison rejects it because he's already lived inside the aftermath of it for 16 years. He doesn't need to be told where the path ends. He grew up at the end of the path. Harry believed the code could save Dexter. He was right in the narrow sense, wrong about the cost. The code gave Dexter a functional life for several decades. It also cost Rita and Deborah and Dokes and everyone else in that web of consequence. Dexter seems to believe, or wants to believe, that a version of this approach could work with Harrison too. That if Harrison has the dark passenger, the answer is to teach him the code rather than to grieve that the passenger exists. It's the same gamble Harry made one generation down. Harrison refuses it. That's the decision at the heart of New Blood's ending. He won't be the next iteration. He won't take the code and the life that comes with it. He sees, clearly enough, where that path ends. Whether that refusal is sufficient to break the chain entirely is what the continuing franchise is exploring. Dexter, Resurrection suggests the story is not over, which means Harrison's decision at the end of New Blood didn't fully close things. But as a statement of intent, as an answer to the question the show has been asking since season 1, Harrison shooting Dexter is the most direct possible refusal of what Harry started in 1973. Harry took in a damaged boy and decided he could shape the damage into something useful. The damage rippled outward across decades and generations. And the final generation of that chain, Harrison, looks at the inherited damage and puts a bullet in it. It's not clean. Nothing in Dexter ever is. But it's an ending of a kind, and it's one the butterfly effect logic earns. The wing beat in 1973 finally comes to rest somewhere in Iron Lake, New York, in a pool of blood on a cold winter night. And then, apparently, it starts again. But that's a story for another evening. We've talked about the code many times across tonight, mostly in terms of how it was made and what it cost. But I want to spend a bit of time with it as a functional object, because the code is one of the more unusual conceits in TV drama. A moral framework for a serial killer, taken seriously by the narrative. Harry designed it around 4 things, roughly. Be certain before you act. Only kill killers, nobody innocent. Don't get caught, and use everything you know about forensics and police procedure to stay ahead. And maintain a normal life as cover. That's it. That's the whole framework. When you say it plainly like that, it sounds like something a man wrote on a quiet evening with the best of intentions. And I think that's exactly what it was. For the first 2 seasons, the code holds up reasonably well in practice. Dexter is methodical, precise, and his targets are, in fact, guilty of serious crimes. The show even makes you root for him, at least some of the time, because the people he's targeting have done things the formal justice system couldn't or wouldn't address. There's a genuine question underneath it that the show is smart enough to keep alive. If someone is provably guilty and the system has failed, is this better than nothing? Season 3 is the first place the code breaks down in a meaningful way, when Dexter kills Oscar Prado by mistake. Oscar was not a killer, Oscar was collateral. The code says only kill killers, and Dexter killed someone who wasn't one. He did it defensively in a moment of panic, which mitigates the culpability somewhat, but the break is real. He violated the code's most fundamental principle almost immediately when circumstances required it. Season 4 is where the code's fourth pillar, maintain the normal life, creates its deepest contradiction. The code is meant to protect Dexter by keeping him embedded in ordinary society. But the ordinary life he's built has its own demands and attachments. Rita cares about him. His children need him. And the code has no provision for that tension, no instruction for what to do when the normal life and the dark passenger come into genuine conflict rather than existing in parallel. Harry imagined them as separate compartments, the killing and the normalcy. He never fully reckoned with what happens when the killing starts to damage the normalcy, or when the normalcy starts to complicate the killing. Season 4 is the season where those compartments collapse into each other. After Season 4, the code starts to erode in more visible ways. In Season 5, Dexter kills Jordan Chase as part of a revenge project for Lumen, which has aspects of the code's logic, but also deviates from it in terms of whose judgment is being applied. He's not just following Harry's rules, he's adopting Lumen's need as a guiding principle. The code becomes more flexible and consequently less absolute. In Season 7, Dexter starts killing people who threaten to expose him, which is a significant departure. Victor Baskov, a mob enforcer who killed a policeman, is targeted partly because he's dangerous in the traditional code sense. But the Ukrainian mob's presence in Dexter's life is driven by Dexter's own actions, not by a pre-existing code target. He's generating threats through his own activity and then using the code as justification for managing them. By Season 8, the code is essentially rhetorical. Dexter invokes it occasionally as a framing device, but the actual decisions he makes that season are driven by emotional attachment, personal vendetta, and the desire to leave cleanly. The code was never designed for any of those situations, and in New Blood, the code barely appears. Jim Lindsay has suppressed it along with everything else. When the dark passenger re-emerges, it does so outside the code's framework entirely. He kills Kurt Caldwell according to a kind of improvised version of the code, but he also kills Logan, a police officer, to escape. Logan was not a killer, he was a man in the wrong place. The code's foundational rule, the one Harry was most insistent about, is broken directly and without the narrative particularly condemning it in the moment. Harrison witnesses the Logan kill, and it's the Logan kill, more than anything else, that seems to finalize Harrison's decision. Not Dexter being a killer, Harrison had already processed that. Not the dark passenger existing, Harrison had already accepted that in himself too, with difficulty. It's the code breaking down in front of him. It's seeing that the rules his father lived by weren't actually rules at all, just preferences that yielded to circumstance when the pressure was high enough. Harry told Dexter that the code was what separated him from the monsters. Harrison, watching his father kill a cop to escape, sees that the line isn't as clear as advertised. There's a version of the code conversation that connects to a bigger question about rules-based ethical frameworks in general. The idea that you can contain the worst impulses of human nature by giving them a set of procedures to follow is, when you say it plainly, a fairly optimistic view of how rules work. Rules get bent. Rules get reinterpreted. Rules that were made for one set of circumstances become inconvenient when circumstances change. And rules maintained by a single person in private with no external accountability drift toward whatever that person needs them to say. Harry built something that worked for a while, then it didn't. And the interesting thing about the show is that Harry, through his ghost voice in Dexter's head, is aware of this by the later seasons. The imagined Harry becomes increasingly uncertain, increasingly questioning, less the confident authority of early seasons and more a voice that is searching alongside Dexter rather than leading him, which suggests in a small way that whatever Dexter is doing at the end of the series, he's doing it without his father's guidance. The real Harry died decades ago. The constructed Harry was always just Dexter talking to himself, and by the time of New Blood, the construction has dissolved too. He's alone with the dark passenger and no code between them. That's probably the truest image the show gives us of who Dexter actually is. Not the man with the rule book, but the man left alone with himself when the rule book has burned. Before we go to the closing, I want to take a step back and say something that I don't think gets said enough about this show. Dexter is not a straightforward good thing. It's not exactly comfortable viewing in 2025 in the way it might have been in 2006. The moral framework of a show about a vigilante serial killer who we're supposed to root for has aged in ways that the show itself didn't fully anticipate. And some of the narrative choices, particularly around female characters like Rita and Deborah, have been correctly criticized for reducing complex women to plot devices for the male protagonist's journey. All of that is fair, but there's something underneath all of it that I think holds up genuinely well, and it's what we've been tracing tonight. The butterfly effect architecture, the way the show is built around the principle that decisions have consequences that outlast the moment of the decision, that the damage you do doesn't stay where you put it, and that the people who pay the highest price are very often not the person who made the choice. Most TV drama, even very good TV drama, doesn't fully commit to this. Characters make terrible decisions and the consequences are absorbed by the next plot development, and eventually the show moves on. Dexter, at its best, makes you feel the weight of prior decisions in the present. Season 5 is haunted by what happened in Season 4 in a specific, tangible way. Season 7 is the delayed consequence of Season 2. New Blood is the reckoning for 8 years of choices. That's not always done with perfect skill. Some seasons are significantly weaker than others, and the show's internal logic has gaps and convenient coincidences that a tighter writer's room might have avoided. But the underlying structure, the sense that this story is one long chain rather than a series of separate dramas, is real. And it's what makes rewatching the show a qualitatively different experience from watching it the first time. When you watch Season 4 knowing what's coming, the whole texture changes. Every scene where Dexter chooses not to kill Trinity is charred differently. Every interaction with Rita, every glimpse of Harrison, every scene where Dexter seems to be getting away with something lands with a different weight. The show is better on rewatch than it is on first viewing because the callbacks and the planted consequences are everywhere once you know to look for them. That's true of the strongest butterfly effect narratives generally. They reward re-engagement because the meaning of early events changes as later events reveal what they were leading to. The shipping container in 1973 means one thing when you hear about it in Season 1. It means something else when Harrison sits on a bathroom floor in Season 4. And it means something else again when Harrison holds a rifle in New Blood. The same image returned to. The weight of it growing each time. There's also something the show does well that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's the specific texture of Dexter's relationships with people who care about him. He's not performing completely. Not always. There are genuine moments across the series where something real is happening underneath the facade. With Harry, even posthumously, with Deborah in the early seasons particularly. With Harrison in the better parts of New Blood. The show is careful not to let Dexter be entirely hollow, because entirely hollow isn't interesting for 8 seasons. And that partial realness is part of what makes the butterfly effect tragedy work as well as it does. If Dexter genuinely felt nothing for any of the people around him, the damage he causes would be different in kind. It would be purely transactional. But he does feel something, imperfectly and incompletely, and not always in the shapes that feelings are supposed to come in, and that's what makes the damage so cumulative. He keeps making the choices that hurt the people he cares about because the part of him that cares can't quite override the part of him that needs to kill. The dark passenger wins. Not always in the moment, but in the end. That is, when you strip it back to the essential, a story about addiction. About the compulsion that outlasts the best intentions. About the relationships that can't survive the thing you can't stop doing, no matter how much you want to stop. The show dresses it in plastic wrap and blood and Miami heat, but the emotional core is recognizably human. Harry was the first to understand this. He saw the compulsion, decided he couldn't extinguish it, and built a framework around it instead. The framework helped for a while. Then the compulsion outgrew the framework, and the people who loved Dexter most were the ones standing closest when it did. And that's where we'll leave things tonight. We started in 1973 in a shipping container in Miami, with a 3-year-old boy sitting in blood. We traced every major decision in the subsequent 50-odd years, the code, and the man who made it, and the man who tried to live inside it, and the people who got caught in the edges of his life, the friend he killed to save his sister, the bodies found in the bay, the ADA he taught and then had to eliminate, the killer he chose to study instead of kill, and the bathtub in a house in Miami where that choice ended, the grief and Lumen and what Lumen was and wasn't, the door that opened at the wrong moment in a church in season 6. Everything Deborah lost in the 5 years that followed, the woman who never stopped believing in Dokes' innocence and what happened to her, the code that turned out to be partly someone else's invention, the final mistake and the storm and Oregon and Iron Lake, and Harrison at the end of it, choosing not to carry what was handed to him. Every one of those moments connects to the one before it. The line from 1973 to Iron Lake, New York is continuous if you follow it closely enough, and that's what makes Dexter the kind of show you can spend an evening thinking about rather than just watching. It's structured like a long, slow consequence, like the life of someone who never fully paid for the first wrong thing they did but paid for it eventually in all the wrong currencies. I've watched this show more times than is probably reasonable, and I still find new threads when I look. The Liddy situation in season 5 and what it tells you about Quinn's character. The way the imagined Harry shifts over the seasons from authoritative to uncertain to essentially absent. The specific texture of Deborah's relationship with her own competence, which gets stronger and then more fragile and then stronger again in ways that track almost exactly with how close she is to Dexter's orbit at any given point. The blood slide sitting in that drawer, season after season, growing, waiting. There's more in here than one evening can hold, which is a good thing, honestly. The best shows leave you with questions rather than closing everything off completely. Even the divisive parts, even the seasons that don't quite land, contribute something to the larger picture. I'd rather have 8 seasons of Dexter, uneven as they are, than a shorter, tighter version that finished more cleanly, but left fewer threads to pull on at midnight. Season 6 gets a lot of criticism, and most of it is valid, but it gave us that one last image in the church doorway. That's worth something. Season 8 gets even more criticism, and most of that is also valid, but it gave us the lumberjack ending that New Blood needed to exist as the story it turned out to be. Even the weaker pieces of the structure served a purpose. That's not always the case with long-running TV. Season 8's ending is still frustrating. The flannel shirt is still a lot to process. Dexter standing in the snow being brooding while the camera holds on his face like an answer is being delivered is, honestly, not an answer. But New Blood earned it in retrospect because it turned that ending into a setup rather than a conclusion. Jim Lindsay in Iron Lake is a better version of that character than Jim Lindsay as a permanent destination. The show found a way to make the unsatisfying ending meaningful by making it provisional. And there's something almost appropriate about that. An ending that wasn't quite an ending for a character who kept escaping consequences. Of course, Dexter's series finale didn't fully close things off. Of course, it felt provisional and incomplete. That's consistent. It's just that in 2013, we didn't know there was a reason for it. Whether Dexter, Resurrection will do something similar with New Blood's ending remains to be seen. It started airing in 2025 with Michael C. Hall back in the role and Clyde Phillips back as showrunner, who was the person most responsible for the strongest seasons of the original run. There's real reason for some optimism there. Phillips understands what made the show work, the butterfly effect architecture, the weight of consequence, the way small decisions accumulate into catastrophic outcomes. If Resurrection leans into that, it has the bones of something worth watching. but I haven't wanted to say too much about it tonight because the whole point of this kind of conversation is to trace patterns that have already formed. It's much easier to follow a chain of cause and effect when you can see the whole chain. Resurrection is still being written, still unfolding. That conversation is for another time. Tonight, we've done what we set out to do, which was to follow the chain. The wing beat and the storm, Harry and Dexter and Brian and Rita and Dokes and LaGuerta and Deborah and Harrison. All of it connecting, all of it landing somewhere, all of it traceable back to one decision, and then another, all the way back to a woman named Laura Moser and a policeman who took her surviving son home. I find that genuinely remarkable when I think about it, that a television show can hold that much causal weight across that many years, and that many characters, and still have it feel cohesive when you look at it whole. It's not perfect. Nothing with 96 episodes and multiple showrunners is going to be perfect, but it's there, the architecture, the bones of it hold. Butterfly, storm, I hope the evening passed well. I hope the stories were gentle company, as they're meant to be. There's something particularly well-suited about Dexter for this kind of late-night, slow walkthrough, I think. It's a show about the night, mostly, about the things that happen when most people are asleep and certain other people are working in the dark. It feels right to spend the small hours with it. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you next time.